Good. Well, everybody, very warm welcome on this rather rainy Friday afternoon in Cambridge to this seminar at the Axon Johnson Centre for the Study of Classical Architecture. A word of apology to, well, actually, not much point in apologising to those in the room or those watching online, because you are here. But if you're going to watch the recording of this seminar later on, and you'll be surprised to see it's taking place, that's because last week, of course, we thought there wouldn't be a seminar in this slot because our speaker was unavailable. So it is actually a great pleasure to say that our visiting postdoctoral fellow, Dr Sadi Maréchal, has very kindly agreed at short notice to step forwards and give us our seminar today, so we don't have a fallow berth. Those of you online, you are very welcome to be with us. If you'd like to put your questions, if you have any, into chat, we'll try to take those at the end of Dr Maréchal's talk. I'm now going to hand over the floor to my colleague, Dr. Colligan Beaufay, who is going to introduce Sadi. So over to you, Colligan. Thank you.
Hello, welcome again to everyone. And it is with great pleasure that we're welcoming today Sadi Maréchal, who's come to us from Kent University, and will be with us, as Frank mentioned, for a month as a visiting scholar of the Center for the Study of Classical Architecture. Sadi is currently a senior postdoctoral fellow at Kent University, where he works on a project on stone domestic buildings in the northwestern provinces. But most of his expertise, and including today's talk, lays with the architecture of Bath buildings, a topic he explored during his doctoral thesis and during a junior postdoctoral fellowship at Kent University, both of them. During these, he explored the bath and bathing habits of the late antique Romans in North Africa, Italy, and the Middle East, before shifting his attention to the rainier northwestern continental parts of Europe, of the empire, to investigate the evolution of bathing habits in these areas. The results of both projects have been published as monographs, the first one with Brill in 2020, and the second one is about to come this year, I think. He also published many articles on bath architecture, on bath technology, bathing practice, bathing news, and his expertise also translates in the field. He is also a field archaeologist with excavations of the Eastern baths in Leptis Magna in Libya, or more recently, Faleri Novi in Italy with Kent University. As a fellow Belgian also working on baths, it is also a personal pleasure to welcome Sadi Maréchal here to our center. And I'll add one note of advertising that we are currently organizing a conference on bath buildings, which will take place in Rome in October this year. So follow us to keep an eye on that, keep an eye out for that. But that's enough of self-promotion. Let us now hear from our speaker with a talk entitled "Washing Away an Indigenous Background, Bathhouses as Proxies for Cultural Change in the Northwestern Corner of the Roman Empire." Behold, Sadi Maréchal.
Yes, thank you, Conlogan, and thank you, Professor Salman, also for this introduction, and thank you to the CSCA for hosting me and asking me to present this seminar. It's my great pleasure to be here. So as said, today we will be talking about Roman bathhouses, but not just about a dull architectural summary of what is a Roman bathhouse, but looking at what can we do with these buildings that can tell us something more about, for example, cultural change and how a Roman cultural sphere interacted with more local cultural spheres. So today, as we think about bathing, about washing, we think about taking a quick shower in the morning. If we think about bathing, we think of these long bathtubs where we lie in for hours soaking. But we have to take in mind that not even 70 years ago, the bathing was a totally different concept. You had no running water at home, and most of the washing was done with these large basins that were filled with heated water on the stove, and then you had to wash yourself with a washing cloth. Or even if we go and look at other parts of the globe, you can see that, for example, in Japan, the concept of a bathing tub is totally different than we have in mind. It's more of a small sitting tub. Or you don't even have to go geographically that far. For example, in Finland, they have a total different approach of human corporality and how one engages with the human body and also with his fellow man. And so it is perfectly normal there, for example, to have business meetings in saunas. They have, in, for example, common apartment blocks. where we would have a shared space for collecting the bins and for garages, etc. They have collective saunas in the cellars of the apartment blocks. Or they have even a sauna installation installed in the local Burger King in Helsinki, which CNN called a very powerful example of globalization. And recently they even added some emoticons to use on WhatsApp to text each other. So you can see that actually a bathing habit and bathing culture is actually really anchored within cultural values and how one sees the human body. And for example, Georges Vigarello, in his book Le Propre et le Sale, linked this to l'imaginaire du corps, so the idea a culture had of the human body. And so for the Romans, this obviously also played a major part in how they saw bathing. And of course, for example, it was to wash off the dirt after a long day's work. But it was also, and this is very important, to keep the body in good health, because Romans, like the ancient Greeks, believed that the body was actually composed of different bodily fluids, they called humors, and these had to be in balance. And so an imbalance of these humors could be adjusted, could be corrected, actually by going to the bathhouse, by sitting in a steam room and treating the body with cold and hot water. And it was also very important to look smart and look perfectly groomed. It was like an officium, it was a duty of the Roman citizens towards their fellow citizens to look good. And it is all in part of the humanitas concept that the Romans had. So we would say civilization, but they saw it as the state of the humans being bodily clean and in good health, as opposed to nature, where you had the difference with the barbarians that were not really presentable, that did not have perfectly groomed hair, etc. And so you can see, for example, this reflected in ancient literature. Plutarch speaking about a certain Favonius that hosted a big dinner party, and thus the guests were already taking place, and he came fresh from his baths, and so he was really just seconds before entering, he was fully refreshed and groomed, and so he presented himself to his guests. Or to illustrate this important medical concept, for example, Suetonius writing about Augustus, Emperor Augustus was struck by disease, that he went to his physician, and that he, after the hot fermentations did not work, advised him to take some cold ones. So here you can see that when these bodily fluids were in imbalance, that there were specific bath regimens, bath treatments with hot water, with cold water, etc. But of course, it was also very important as a social event. It was, first of all, a very pleasurable experience, as it is still today, going to a hot water bathtub. And it is also linked to this, what the Romans thought of the otium concept. As the otium is the idea of leisure, what we would now translate more or less like leisure. And so, for example, a passage about the Emperor Commodus in the Scriptores Historia Augusta, a 4th century source, tells us that he used to bathe 7 or 8 times a day and was in the habit of eating while at the baths. Apuleius in his Metamorphoses speaks about that the rest of the day he passed away at the baths and in banqueting. Or Martial in his epigram says that a certain Cotta used to meet his new. Bathing was very popular because it was also a social event and people went to the baths together. And then a third important aspect was that bathhouses were also considered to be marvels of architecture and technology. The Romans, they not invented, but they perfected a system that was already introduced in the Greek Hellenistic world, about warm water being piped through channels and an underground heating system. You can see that also in for example, excerpts like in Sidonius Apollinaris, where he speaks about hot water going to the lead pipes, walls heated and chambers heated from beneath, and streams that were diverted to go to the baths. For example, in Ausonius Mosella, about this fire that was caught within the walls of the bathhouse. So really, for a victory of civilization, of Roman culture over nature, trying to capture heat, trying to capture warmth, and putting it to the advantage of the Romans within these architectural marvels. And for those of you not very familiar with Roman bathhouses, so the most important technological aspect was this underground heating system, which we call the hypercaust system. So where heated gases from a furnace were slowly sucked into this void underneath the floor, and then traveling up into the hollow walls, which you see there often with these box tiles that we call tubuli, and then exiting the building through chimney pipes. And so they had this really technological innovation that allowed them to heat large spaces, that in contrast to the Greek technology, where bathtubs were filled individually with warm water. And so they had to have an architecture that was adapted, that was an enabling environment to enable all these specific aspects of bathing, to socialize, but also to take care of one's health. So when Romans entered the bathhouse, whether it was in Italy or North Africa or Spain, they had certain expectations what to find there. And they had expectations that when you entered, you had a dressing room, then first was the cold room, then you had a tepid room, and then you had a hot room. And with larger bathhouses, you could also have some auxiliary rooms with, for example, sweat rooms, etc. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, architecture also provides cues for those using them. It was still when we enter, for example, a swimming pool today, you are having certain pointers and where to take off your clothes, where to shower, etc. So architecture also guides those using it. And you can see that, for example, also in letters, for example, by Plinius, where he describes one of his bath houses inside in one of his houses. So a cooling room with and then a hot room, and then of course also a cold room. Or for example, Lucian in his text Hippias, or the Bath, where he describes a fictitious bathhouse. So he starts by guiding the readers to capacious locker rooms, and then a cold hall, then a slightly warmed hall, some rooms for massages, then a hot corridor, and then at the end, a hot room with 3 hot tubs. And then he says, when you have bathed, you don't need to go back to the same rooms, but you can go directly to the cold room through a slightly tepid room. So it was very important also to end with this cold room, as you can see here in the text. Also, the Colloquia Monacensia is like a sort of textbook in Latin and Greek, where like in a more assimile method for students, the reader is taken through several public buildings and public spaces. And with the description of the bathhouse, you can also see that the first room is actually the tepid room. Then you go to the sudatorium, to the sweat room. Then you enter the hot pool. And at the end, you swim in the cold pool. So they had a very good idea of what this whole bathing procedure, this itinerary throughout the building would consist of. And so you can see this also reflected, of course, in the architecture. When you see, for example, the very famous example of the Stabian baths in Pompeii, where you have at the late 1st century BC, 2 separate wings. One wing in the north for the female bathers, and one part in the south for the male bathers. You can see all the different rooms. You can have a a dressing room, a tepid room, and then a hot room with a hot pool. And then as the latest addition was this cold pool. So this was actually the part of the Roman bathhouses that were added in the last phase. And you can see here that, for example, it was kind of clumsily added to the dressing room in the female section, this cold pool, by dismantling part of the sitting bench and shutting the lockers on top of it. And so this was the last part of the bathhouse in Roman bathing evolution that was added. But this is also already at the late 1st century BC, and this is important to keep in mind for the rest of the lecture. And you can see also that from the very start, the Romans would export these bathhouses to the provinces. For example, if we look at Roman bathhouses in Gallia Narbonensis, so in the south of France, you can see that these very early examples already existed, where, for example, in Glanum, there is no cold room present yet. So this bathhouse was constructed at a time that the cold room was not part of the standard scheme of the bathhouse yet. Same for Badalona, Baitulo in present-day Spain, where this small public bathhouse actually only had a cold pool, so the piscina here, added to the dressing room in a later phase. And so the original building did not have this cold section yet. In more private context, so private bathhouses, we see that, for example, in Fréjus or in Orange, that bathhouses from the late 1st century BC already had this this cold pool here in blue. So if moving towards the end of the 1st century BC, we see that cold pool becomes an integral part of the bathhouse. And so we come to the standard, more or less standard canonical plan of Roman baths that will be also exported throughout the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries AD to the provinces, where you have a large exercise yard or a palaestra here in green with an open-air swimming pool or a natatio. Then you have a dressing room called an apoditerium. You have a cold room called the frigidarium with the cold pool or the piscina in Latin. Then you have a tepidarium, so the tepid room, of course, a caldarium or a hot room with several hot pools called an alveus or a solium, and then a sweat room called a sudatorium, or in a previous denomination, a laconicum, which is this red room with a semicircular apsis here. So this is the form that we will see throughout the empire, and which by modern scholars has been called like the standard or the canonical plan of Roman baths. Now, the research area which we were going to focus on today consists mainly of, or more or less modern-day Belgium. So it was divided in 3 civitates, so 3 administrative units called the civitas Menapiorum, so from the Menapi tribe, the civitas Nerviorum of the Nervian tribe, and the Atuatuca Tungrorum of the Atuatuki, which is the largest part, and which were subdivided then first as part of Gaul, but then after the reign of Domitian, the civitas Tungrorum was incorporated in the Germania Inferior. So nevertheless, 3 different regions, each with their own specific indigenous background, and also with its own geology and landscape, of course. Now, in order to see cultural change, we first, of course, have to see if there is something known about pre-Roman bathing habits in the region. Now, the evidence is very flimsy, it's very piecemeal. The only thing we do have are some small attestations in Latin literature, no texts of their own. For example, Tacitus, but he's more writing about the Germans, but still, this is one of the few attestations we have about bathing habits, that he says that the Germans, they used to sleep well into the day, and then when they woke, they washed usually in warm water, because the winter bulked so large in their lives. That's something we can also relate to here up north. In the research area, there were no natural hot springs, with the exception of Chaufontaine, which is what's in the name. There's a literally meaning hot spring, and which is still bottled water today. But there, no Roman remains were found. There are no thermal baths. For example, in England, you have Bath. In Germany, you have Aachen. But in this research area, so no such thing. The only city that might come up is the city of Spa, which will all be familiar to you as also giving its name to the Spa culture, of course. But there were no Roman remains found there, and actually that's only from the 17th century onwards that Spa will be a real thermal town. And there is no hot water there, it's just water that's very rich in iron. So the Romans were the first to introduce buildings for public bathing, for communal bathing within the region. You can, of course, immediately think of the impact of the military. So the military conquest starts under Caesar, but then you have only, and this is known through his own writings, temporary military camps. There is no, for the moment, no archaeological information about these camps available in research area. And there is, in any case, very little evidence of this first military settlement in the area. So not only from the Caesarean period, but also afterwards. We know, for example, from the column of Trajan that the army was often actively involved in construction, not only of their own fortresses, but also within the settlements that surrounded these fortresses. And we also know this through the texts. There are some literary passages that hint at the involvement of the army within construction, but also of tile stamps of the army on, for example, ceramic building materials. And for this first phase, what we might expect, but it hasn't been found yet in research area, would be these kind of wooden bath buildings. So wooden bath buildings did exist. There were some 5 or 6 examples known throughout Europe. One of these in perhaps the most famous one in Vindonissa in present-day Switzerland, already dating from the Tiberian age, where the only elements in stone was for this large water basin and for, of course, the furnace. But such examples have not been found in Belgium yet. Now, and from the time of Augustus onwards, and then certainly under Claudius, the region will be more or less urbanized in the way that there are civic centers, small civic centers, small towns being constructed along the new road works as well. So a very important road going from Boulogne-sur-Mer, Ghisoriacum in modern day France to Tongeren as one of the main east-west traffic arteries in Roman periods in Belgium, but also coming from the capital Bavay, Bagacum, going to Tongeren, of course. And so you see that along these traffic arteries, some small settlements do arrive. And the fortresses are mainly, those excavated in Belgium are mainly late antique fortresses. So along the coast here, and also more along the rivers. So the examples of Oudenburg, Aardenburg in the Netherlands, Furfos, for example, or Liberchy. But so the bathhouses that have been found there are late antique and not of this early period. The first baths in the research area are dated to the first century AD, and for the first examples, the middle of the first century, but there are very few examples in civic centers. One of the exceptions is in the Vicus of Tienen. And you can see a relatively small bathhouse of around 200 square meters dating from the Flavian period. And then in Roman villa sites with an obvious Mediterranean character, with a lot of Mediterranean imports, so that we can reasonably assume that the people living here were Romans in the sense of the word, that they were perhaps army veterans or people coming from the Mediterranean. For example, the bathhouse in the Villa of Harcourt had even a small mosaic inscription with some Latin letters. And there was some writing equipment found, so we know that whoever owned this bathhouse or whoever commissioned this bathhouse actually was able to read or to write Latin. And so all the standard rooms are already present. You can see here the pools are depicted in gray. That's and the heated rooms are with these square hypocaust pillar symbol. And so that the cold room, the tepid room, and the hot room were already present in these very early examples. And it's in the 2nd and the 3rd century AD that we have the real construction boom of Roman bathhouses and in the research area. Not only villas, but also in the civic centers and in, for example, road relay stations, etc. So the public baths are poorly understood in this region because we have a continuity of modern cities. Cities like Tongeren, Bavay, Tournai just lie on top on the Roman remains. And therefore, it is very difficult if we do have a small section of the city that is being excavated. We only have a limited window to see the Roman remains. And so it is often difficult if we do find a hypocaust to know if this belongs to a Roman bathhouse or if this belongs to just a heated room of the house. And if we do find a pool that is evidence of a bathhouse, of course, is this pool then part of a private house of a domus, or is this part of a public bathhouse? So important problems arise here. What we can say is that there are no large imperial types like we would find in the largest cities of the empire, of course Rome, but also closer to the research area in Trier, for example, or in Xanten, where you do have these symmetrical larger bathhouses. Here we have, in Belgium, we have a lot of small towns with very modest bathhouses, with very basic plans. As you can see the examples again here in Tienen or in Grobendonck, with very few exercise yards and open air swimming pools. And this is probably also to do with the fact that this part of the Roman Empire was never introduced to the gymnasium complexes and the sports ideas of the Greek Hellenistic world, and contrary to the Mediterranean. And the typical location of these bathhouses is in the urban fabric, near traffic arteries, near other public spaces, etc. As you can see here, the example in Clavier-Vervos, where the bathhouse depicted here in blue is very close to a small temple of Fanum, and located with its access along the main traffic artery. So nothing really sensational here. This is what we also see, in different parts of the Roman Empire. The only larger public bathhouses, for example, here in Famar, the ancient Fanum Martis, you can see in the name Fanum, it's already a religious site. The only examples come from larger cities or these important religious centers, also in Fontaine-Valmont, where we have the only real examples of open air swimming pools, so these so-called nataciones, and probably also an exercise yard or a palaestra. But you can see here, these are the largest examples, and we only speak about 2,600, 1,500 square meters, so still quite modest in size. Now, what's more interesting then is if we're going to look at the baths on rural estates, and I say rural estates not to say villas, because villas implies a certain Mediterranean aspect that is not always present in the northern part of the Roman Empire. And you see a wide variation in plan size, in elaboration of the plan, in decorative forms as well. You can see here that these are often standard successions of a cold room, a tepid room, and a hot room with one cold pool and then one or two heated pools. The shape of the rooms is often rectangular, and in some cases you do have semicircular shapes, for example, for pools. And so these are spread a bit throughout the research area, but you can see a clear focus around the river Meuse, which runs, of course, from more or less south of Bavay towards Tongeren, and which is also follows this main traffic artery. And if we can compare the presence of these Roman villa baths and baths on rural estates to the location of Roman villas as a whole, then you can clearly see that there is a correlation between the geology, so the soil of the region, and of course the presence of these villas, which were mainly and rural estates, which were mainly agricultural estates. And you can see that they of course cluster around this very fertile loam belt, and with very few examples on the sandy acidic soils, more to the north, in what is now part of the Netherlands and Flanders. And then of course south in the research area, you have the massif of the Ardennes, which is also very poor for agriculture. So you can see here, if we compare both maps, that there actually is, of course, same one-on-one relation between the presence of private bathhouses and villas. But what was also remarkable is that a lot of these villas actually had a bathhouse. So, for example, in the Civitas Menampiorum, so we're talking about the most northern part, of the 21 villa sites that have more or less been identified, 5 had a bathhouse, so more or less 24%. In the Civitas Nerviorum, these were 18 out of 45, or there we have already 40% of the villas that actually, and rural estates that actually had a bathhouse. And in the Civitas Tungrorum, out of 260 rural sites, 95 had a bathhouse, so around 36%. And if we, for example, compare this more to the Mediterranean region, to the, for example, the region that Annalisa Marzano in her book discussed, she looked at the villas in Latium, and there she came to a percentage of around 18% of the villas that had a bathhouse. And so there's also probably something to do with the fact that these regions were less urbanized. There were less cities, less civic centers that had public baths. And so if the people wanted to bathe, they had to have a bathhouse in their villa site. Now, if we are going to look at the surface that these bathhouses took in the ground floor of villas, and this, of course, is only for baths that were actually integrated within the house and not standing detached from it. We see that this percentage varies between 6 and 18%. So there's quite a large part of the houses actually were taken in by bathing facilities. And if you can see here, as you can see here in the example of Hayo in Belgium, where only a very basic ground plan of the house itself, with actually very little diversification or specification of rooms. And there you have one large hall, you have a portico, and you have 2 angular pavilions, but then you do have this bathhouse that is attached to one side of the house. And so proportionately, these are quite heavy investments, and there's people living in these houses were actually prepared to spend a lot of money on these baths that required, of course, specific building materials, that required fuel, that required water supply, that required wastewater disposal, that also required personnel for maintaining these baths, firing these baths, keeping these baths warm, etc. And so you can understand that owning such a bathhouse was very much about having a certain prestige of your house. It was, of course, as it was in the Mediterranean, a bathhouse, a preferred space to maintain social relations with your peers. And it was also, as I said before, necessary if you wanted to have this civilized way of life, if you wanted to present yourself to the people coming to visit you on your estate, then you had to have at least some facilities to make yourself decent, to take a bath, to be nicely groomed. And you have to have this humanitas within nature, and it's not by coincidence that when Roman literature first speaks about Gaul, they speak about Gallia comata, which literally means the Gauls with the wild hairs, with the wild and bushy hairs. And so you can see there that this aspect of grooming and about presentability is actually what distinguishes someone with a civilized way of life from a barbarian. You can also see this in, for example, the letters of Cicero, which he writes to his friend Atticus, where he says that, come on over, and when you come over, I will order my baths to be heated, and my wife Terence is also going to invite Pomponia. So there you can see that this social aspect is very important. We're going to bathe together. or in another letter that he writes, he says that he will arrive in his villa in Tusculum on the 7th day of thereafter, see that everything is ready. I will have others with me, and we shall stay there for considerable time, I think. If there is no disc in the bathhouse, have one put in, and everything that is necessary for supporting a life and health. And so here you can also see that health aspect that is still very important. Now, this is, of course, for authors writing about Italy, mainland Italy. But here we are in a far-flung region, a peripheral region of the empire. But there you do see that, for example, in large Roman-style villas, such as at Harcourt or in Bathhouses, that fairly elaborate, large baths are actually incorporated or attached to these mansions. And often they have also a separate entrance for the guests. Here in Harcourt, the example depicted in red. This is something which I will return on later. And some of these larger villas had very elaborate baths, sometimes with additional heated rooms, with heated dressing rooms, etc. Some of them, like you can see here in Amptine Champion, also surpass the surface of public baths. You can remember the bathhouse I showed in Tienen or in Robendonk, which had more or less 200 square meters of surface. This bathhouse has 340 square meters. They also had some exceptional features. For example, these heated pools called Calida Piscina, which were only found, for example, in Italy in the very expensive top-end villas, for example, in Stabia and the Villa San Marco, which already for the Mediterranean were quite exceptional. We see these pools in some of the largest villas here. And so we can see that they went all the way. They really did the effort of making elaborate baths. We see bathhouses with mosaic floors that are embellished with wall paintings, even with important marbles, etc. So here you can see also an aspect of elite competition, as in your baths are bigger and better than yours. And we see that some of these baths actually get larger and bigger and evolve with the villa as time goes by. For example, this example of Harcourt, where this very large villa actually had in phase 1 a bathhouse that was detached from the villa. In phase 2, it was connected to the villa by this long corridor, so that people could, on a rainy day, could go dry or sheltered from the sun as well to the bathhouse. And in the third and second phase also, that these large heated pools were added. Some villas also increased the surface and the features of their baths, as the example here right in Gesve, where this original small bathhouse depicted in black was actually enlarged with all the walls you can see here depicted in white, and so with larger pools and more pools. Or in the example left in Merble-Château, where an integrated bathhouse in the villa, here bath 1, was actually dismantled when the larger bath 2 was built. And so, for example, or probably this bath 1 became perhaps too small for the villa owner, or perhaps out of date, and he decided to build a larger, bigger bathhouse that was more up to standards, probably. What is really interesting is also if we look at, or if we zoom in on certain areas, for example, here south of the river Meuse, a very rural area with very few civic centers, with very, very few small towns. The only example being here, the example shown before Clavier-Vervos. You see that all of these villas within a 10-kilometer radius from each other, all the bathhouses here actually had, all the villas here actually had a bathhouse. There's only one example from the immediate vicinity in Haltien that did not have a bathhouse, and even there it is possible that we just missed it in the excavations because not the entire site was excavated. So you can see here is from the 11 bathhouses, from the 11 villa sites, 10 had actually a bathhouse. And you can see that these were not only the very large examples, such as the example in Amptine Champion, where in the last phase it was more than 300 square meters. You also had a very modest bathhouse of around 50 to 60 square meters in surface, as the example in Flostois. But what is interesting is that all these villas in the same region, in the same day, a day's walk from each other, actually had a bathhouse. And perhaps they were more or less also contemporaneous, more or less all in use during the 2nd century AD. Perhaps this element of competition is not really always trying to surpass your neighbor, but just keeping up with your neighbor. Right? The expression of keeping up with the Joneses, you know that your neighbor had a bathhouse, and as soon as you had the necessary funds, you will build a bathhouse as well, because you could not only be the idiot in the entire neighborhood without a bathhouse. And so this form of elite competition is of course difficult to detect archaeologically, but we do still have some important pointers in that direction. Also, if we look at the location of these baths on the rural estates, I already said that some of the baths could be integrated well within the house, but they could also be attached to it or completely freestanding, as the following 3 examples show here. And of course, if a bathhouse is integrated within the house, then you would expect that the people living inside the house would have better access to it, and that outsiders, perhaps guests or friends or whatever, had perhaps not access to this specific bathhouse. And we know from example from Vitruvius, who writes about the Roman houses in Italy, that the deeper one penetrated within the house, the more exclusive it became and the closer you were to the master of the house. And so this could also be a case in point here. And so, for example, a bathhouse that was detached from the house, completely detached, was also more accessible for people not necessarily going inside of the house. Large villa estates, such as the example here in Antey in Belgium, even had several bathhouses. And these, although it is very difficult to know if these 3 bathhouses were contemporaneous in use, because the excavations date from the 19th century, but it seems that way, that they were contemporaneous in use. So if there were different bathhouses within the same estate, perhaps these bathhouses were aimed at a different clientele, were aimed at different groups of people. And this is even more so the case if we look at, for example, the rural estate of Mettey, where you have 2 bathhouses, one belonging to the pars urbana of the villa estate. And so this is actually the line dividing the rural part of the estate with the living part, the more urban part of the estate. And so one bathhouse, bath 1, was located more within this living part of the villa, while the other bathhouse, bath 2, he depicted on the right, was actually located within the workspace, within the agricultural space. And so this bathhouse was perhaps meant for the people working on the estate. And we do have some literary passages that confirm that actually sometimes the master of the house did provide baths for their workforce. For example, Columella in his De Agricultura writes that there is a balnea rustica, a bath for the country folk, for it is important that there be such places in which the household may bathe, but only on holidays, for the frequent use of baths is not conducive to physical vigor. And so we do have some confirmation within ancient literature that sometimes a master of the house could effectively give a bathhouse to his workforce. And this is also, for example, in the United Kingdom, the case where we find similar examples, for example, here at Gorhambury, where the only bathhouse of this villa estate was actually located within the rural part of the estate and not within the urban part. And so probably also accessible, be it perhaps not always, but on specific special occasions for the people working the lands and living on the estate. And so you can see, for example, here in Yécré that there is one bathhouse that is within the villa itself, and then a second bathhouse that lies around some 10 meters to the east of it. There was actually a separate bathhouse, perhaps also to entertain guests, and perhaps also for people living the land, who knows. Or the interesting example of Nivelles, where actually several main buildings were found, but only one bathhouse that was completely freestanding. And here you could even envisage that perhaps these different villa owners, these different house owners, actually invested together, for example, in one bathhouse that was not attached to one of these residences, but that was freestanding and could be used by all of the residents of this villa estate. So perhaps here there is an example of not really a top-down approach of one dominus, one master of the house giving, for example, living in Villa A here, living in there and giving a bathhouse to the rest, but perhaps all these people chipping in together to build one bathhouse that could be used by all. So this could also be an example. It does not have to be always top-down. And then to conclude, we have, this is also a very interesting aspect, some very basic facilities on sites with a very indigenous character. These are always small bathhouses consisting only of a heated part. And in the literature here in modern literature here in England, the scholars have called them standalone calderia, so standalone warm rooms. And these have been found in my research area in sites with a distinctive pre-Roman settlement pattern. So where already during the Iron Age, immediately preceding the Roman period, post-built houses were present. And in some cases, like this example here in Heestert, actually the stone structure from the Roman period is actually a more or less petrification of the wooden building that was already present during the Iron Age. And we see that these are also sites with very strong local material culture, very few imports, very few terra sigillata, amphorae, etc. So we can have a good idea that these were actually sites of a more indigenous elite that at some point decided to invest their wealth in what is only a part of the Roman bathing habit. And as I said before, this is important because the Romans themselves, they thought of the body as composed of these different humors, the bile, the black bile, the phlegm, blood. And the architecture of the baths was conceived so that if there was an imbalance in this composition of the humors, that the baths, they could restore that. And so the importance of the cold bath was that it closed the pores after you had your hot bath. And you can see here, for example, in an excerpt in Sidonius Apollinaris, that he said that once that the bath was not ready, he asked his servants to make a makeshift bath made of branches and goat skins, and he made some kind of a vapor bath. And in these vapor baths, we passed whole hours and talked lively, etc. So here you can see again the social aspect. And then when we had perspired enough, and we were bathed in hot water, then it left us languid. They were depleted. And therefore, we finished off with a bracing douche in the fountain, the well, or the river. So this cold ending of the bathing habit, of the bathing itinerary, was really important because in the conception of the Romans, at least in the Mediterranean, it would seem that after the hot bath, you were left weakened. Some classical authors even call it an effeminating effect. And you can see that then in these small baths, standalone calderia, no such investment was made to have this cold section of the bathhouse. There's always the possibility that they used like perhaps a small cold tub or a small cold basin. But in any case, they did not choose to invest their money in what was actually more or less the less cost-expensive part of the bathhouse. It was the heated part that was expensive because you had to have your fuel, because you have your water supply, etc. And sometimes these small standalone caldera were even the only stone buildings on an entire site. For example, here in Yvelet, Clavia, where you have post-built buildings all over the site, but you have a cellar that is made in stone, and then you have this bathhouse that is made in stone. And so there again, you have probably a very strong indigenous site that did choose to invest in the specific heated part of the Roman baths. For example, here in Outrelou as well, where you can see this very basic form, which was also found in the vernacular architecture in the region, but then still a small heated section with a pool was added as only feature of the bathhouse. And so these baths are not only found in the more rural parts. They were a bit scattered throughout the research area. Or one could expect that, for example, in regions with less villas, that such baths may perhaps be more of a standard, but in the research area that was not the case. And so my research area, to make the link across the channel, was not an exception, because in England as well, such examples have been found. We're here in the north part of Britannia. You can see here Hadrian's Wall, where you have the rural estate, I must say, of Faverdale, where this small stone structure was also found. It was only around 17 square meters in surface, dating to the 2nd century. And which was so heated. There is no direct evidence of a pool, but there is always a possibility. And there window glass and wall paintings were found within the destruction layer. So here also we do have this kind of standalone caldarium as only part of the stone building. And the same in Ingleby, Warwick, so at Quarry Farm, which is actually quite close to Faverdale, where we have this very small standalone caldarium as well, that was later transformed into a corn dryer, and which was detached from the main villa building. And so we have a local elite, probably local, that was choosing to invest in one specific part of the bathing habit that was incidentally the most expensive in its construction, use and maintenance. But that does seem to show that they did not adopt the entire culture of the Roman culture of the body as proposed by the Romans. And so the Roman bathhouse in this part of the empire did not come in as a prefab element with all the specific parts, with all the standard rooms that had to be included. You can see that at a certain point, some people decided only the heated part would be of interest to them. And so you have probably a local elite that is negotiating its own place of power within a local setting. So to sum up, with this introduction of a new, entirely new bathing building in a region that was not familiar with communal bathing habits before, you can see 3 responses. On the one hand, you have the adoption, of course, and these were the important bathhouses that were made in civic centers by the authorities. These were made in the military context. These were also made in Mediterranean-style villas, and also some local elites obviously adopted the entire Roman bathhouse. So you have this humanitas concept that was obviously still very important, the civilization within nature, civilization within the countryside. You have this otium and pleasure aspect that is obvious from the size of these bathhouses. These were not to have your standard quick wash at the end of the day. These were obviously opulent, large buildings where you could invite others. So you have this social aspect, and you, of course, have also this wealth and status aspect that you could see that you had access to this Roman technology, you had access to the people making this. And then you can see that there is a competition aspect coming, building bigger baths, building newer baths, and also aspects, of course, of social exclusion and inclusion. Tenants or workforce on the estate that may or may not have been able to bathe on the estates and not in, of course, civic centers that were too far away. On the other hand, you also had an adaptation. You can see that some rural sites, with these indigenous backgrounds, did not take over the entire Roman bathhouse or the entire Roman bathing habit, but had like a piecemeal borrowing, sort of a recontextualization of the bathing habit, and they only built the part that took their fancy. And so we have probably people here that negotiate their local power within their own community. And then, of course, a last response that was not touched upon here, but is also very difficult to see, is, of course, the resistance or the indifference to the Roman bathing habit. And this is, of course, what can be expected in the so-called non-villa landscapes, where you don't have any form of Roman architecture whatsoever. But it is, of course, very difficult to gather from the archaeological data, because as the argumentum ex silentio goes, you cannot say that because it was not there that this is actually proof of resistance towards this Roman bathing culture or Roman architecture in general. So this is what, in a nutshell, what I hoped to have shown, that Roman bathhouse and very specific type of Roman building with its associated and underlying cultural values can help us to understand a bit more how Roman cultural sphere and Mediterranean cultural sphere interacted with more northern local cultural spheres and what could be possible outcomes. So most of these things have already been published, and as has been mentioned before, most of it will be also repeated in the book that is coming at the end of April. There's also an accompanying website that's more interactive and you can see the baths in Belgium. So if any of these interest you, do not hesitate to contact me. So that, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you very much, Sadi, for a brilliant talk, which I think shows how multifaceted those baths can be. A series of examples of approaches, there are many more, but also how what we can say when we look beyond examples and we look at baths at a global, regional scale. So I obviously have a lot of questions, but I have a month to ask them to you, so I will not ask all of them. But I will just start with asking you, since now you're in the UK, how much do you expect the picture you've shown us for Belgium to be similar or different in southern Britain, where you also have this kind of density of villas?
Yes, so that's one of the reasons I'm actually here in Cambridge, is to look at those villas that here are in Britain. The examples that I've shown, and there are some more, obviously state that similar patterns or ideas about whether or not to adopt Roman bathhouses were certainly present within this part of the empire. And then again, you also have these large villas like Lullingstone and whatever, and Winterton, etc., that do have these elaborate bathhouses. So I do expect that there is a certain similarity across the channel, and there have always been, on the level of architecture and villa architecture, etc., there have always been good links between the two sides of the channel. So I would expect that as I go further into this matter, that I think, yeah, similar patterns will definitely arrive.
It's open to the floor. Frank, then Margaret.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I was very interested what you said about the investment, and I wondered if you can tell us a bit more about decoration and how far these people are going into the investment. And also, I guess that's something you're familiar with. I heard a talk by Giacomo Savani about his talk on, and I got this idea of colonization of the senses. So for the people that's forthcoming, and that's actually something that's very similar to your topic. And the idea of this colonization of the senses is interesting, but I was wondering in the same time, because there's not, are there proof for a lot of Roman citizens? There are not many colonies in these regions, whether it is in England or Belgium. And so to what extent this colonization, this concept of colonization is valid? And
yeah, thank you for the very interesting question. And it is a topic that I tackle in the book, but for a question of time, I didn't hear. But what is very interesting is that for these, most of the site actually in Belgium is that there is a lot of, for example, wall paintings are found basically everywhere, even in the smallest of these bathhouses. But what is interesting is that very few examples of figurative art in wall paintings, but also in mosaics, have been found. And so we mainly have geometric or floral designs, but almost never figures, almost never persons depicted. Mosaics as well are often only in black and white. If color is applicable, then it's often in small pieces of terra sigillata. And even in a large capital like Tongeren, few mosaics, for example, have been found. So the technique was probably not available to everyone. We do see that wall paintings were more widespread, but then these are often just white. These are colors. The fragments that we do find are white planes, red planes, are some white fragments with yellow or blue or green lines on them. So it seems that they were only geometric. So this has probably also something to do with this native background. And that's also what Martin Millet proposed in his book, is that because they did not have this, in contrast to the Mediterranean, this how you call it, tradition of depicting figures, that they were not going to suddenly start just because they have new ways of decorating their houses. And so they were taking over more or less the technology. And we see that even there are wall paintings that actually cover Watland Daub walls. And so it doesn't have to be stone, but so they're also using the technology, but they're using it in a way that makes sense to them. So why bother depicting a whole scene of Aeneas if your neighbor next door to you doesn't know who Aeneas is? So they stuck to what they know. They use the language, or more or less the techniques, but they don't seem to copy the entire thing. But in England, in some villas in England, you do have these figurative mosaics, etc. But in Belgium, we almost have no examples of that. And even for wall painting, very few examples. So I think in that sense that indeed decoration of these baths could also point to even further to more local ideas about how to decorate these baths. Yeah.
Frank had a question, then Matt. And if there are any questions online,
yeah.
Okay.
Look, take them online. Hopefully, a short, respectful question.
Well, two questions that are kind of connected from Isabel Wayne and Lloyd Clements. First asks, the bathhouses with one room, is this something that is only seen in this area of the empire, or is there any evidence that this is being replicated elsewhere? And then the second question is, where does this work sit in the debate around Romanization, globalization within the empire? It strikes me that we may be underestimating a pragmatic approach. The lack of a frigidarium might have more to do with regional climate than necessarily to do with social practices or indigenous traditions. So yeah.
So the first part of the question, as I showed, so in England there are indeed some examples. There's also more obviously the same region in Germania Inferior, just across my research area. There are some small examples. So we do see that this is a phenomenon. I wouldn't say that it's replicated, but it is a phenomenon that seems to exist in the larger northern part of the empire. In any case, as for the fact that it could have been indeed weather related, so that's always indeed has been claimed. I would say that we have a lot of examples where you do have these very small bathhouses, even as small as the ones of the standalone caldera that I showed, but that do have this small cold section, even if it is only a very small pool for one person. But there you can see that, money was still invested in this cold part. And I do think that rather than being it a question of climate, the omission of this frigidarium is more to do with a deliberate choice. Perhaps it could also have been a deliberate choice, not or only to invest a specific sum and then only choosing for the pleasurable heated part. But then again, it is a definite choice of a certain owner not to build it, I think. And if you would conceive, if you would go to the military, or you go to whoever builds bathhouses in your area, and you go to them and you say, I want a bathhouse, for example, and we know that there are some texts where there are kind of Roman architects that do have books with designs of Roman bathhouses, and I think the example of Pinen and Harcourt shows it quite well, that some standard forms must have circulated. If you go to such a person and you say, make me a bathhouse, he would have included, I think, a cold section. You would have to specify that you don't want a cold section, because that seems to have been the standard. Yeah.
Frank, you had a question.
My question was a material one. Though, just to reflect on that last question, I think in Britannia, you only have to get outside the bath or outside the room to close those pores up, right? Quite a different experience from being in the Mediterranean. Materiality, yeah. So obviously, I guess one reason you build a bath building in stone, if it's going to have a hypercaust, is fire retardants. Do you find evidence of fire damage? Might that be a reason why a villa might have a bath complex inside the villa and then builds one outside? Were these always used simultaneously, or is it possible that you move to a more remote location for fire retardants?
Yeah, well, exactly. So a lot of scholars have often used the argument about the pragmatic arguments of, yeah, you have a fire hazard, or you have to have the water supply that is decisive in the location of your bathhouse. And I think that in some cases, there's definitely evidence that, for example, a good water supply or a good wastewater disposal was at the core of the location. But then again, for example, for the fire hazard, we do have heated rooms also within the villa structures or houses. And so the fire hazard would also have been present there. So moving only your bathhouse outside of your house would have not reduced the fire hazard in that case. And we also have cases where the only structural link between the bathhouse and the house or the villa is actually the furnace room. So the only room where the actual danger is was the only actual link. And so that from a pragmatic point of view, that's not really sensible. So I think that in some options it's may have played or definitely will have played a role. But I think questions of water management might be more decisive, but also on where to locate in the sense of where do we have space, where is an obvious location if we want to get the firewood and the water, etc., to the bathhouse. Also, winds could have played a role, because if you stoke, there would have been smoke, etc. So perhaps not placing your bathhouse with the main wind, so that you wouldn't be in the smoke, etc. So yeah, a variety of options could have played a role, but it's not always decisive, in my opinion. That's at least what the archaeological data seems to suggest.
Do you have time for another question, or is food beckoning us?
I have questions, but I'll ask them.
Yeah.
Maybe we should go.
So it's about time to bring the discussion to a close. I hear food burning for us. So let us thank Sadi once again for a brilliant talk. And